Hi, my name is Raz, and today I'm going to be talking to you about React Native, which is a native mobile web development it's a native mobile development framework, not a web development framework. So before I talk to you about React Native, I want to give you an overview of the different types of mobile applications. Essentially, there's two types of applications that you can run on your phone. You have a web application and a mobile application. A web application you can run on your browser, and a mobile application you can run on one of two platforms, either iOS or Android. Each of these types have their subsets. We have basic web applications, which you just access via a mobile web browser. And then you have progressive web applications, which until now, web applications didn't really show a lot of the functionality that native applications did, but now progressive applications have entered the scene, and slowly that's changing, and they're giving native frameworks a run for their money. Native applications are usually written in platform-specific languages, such as Swift for iOS or Java for Android, and they're available on the App Store. Some examples of native apps are iBooks, Clock, Google Maps, and so on. Native apps make it a lot more easier to tap into your phone's features, such as GPS, camera, swipe gestures, and push notifications. If you take a look at the examples I mentioned on your phones, you'll notice they follow similar platform-specific style guides, which is what gives them their native look and feel. A hybrid application is a combination of a web application and a native application. It's not to be confused with the progressive web app. The difference is that a hybrid app is available on the App Store. What is React Native and how does it work? So React Native, similar to React, is an open source project created by Facebook. It allows the development of cross-platform mobile applications using our favorite language, JavaScript, which communicates with native components on either Android or iOS through a bridge. This is great news because most companies want their apps on both platforms, and now you don't need to learn Swift, Objective-C, or Java to build an iOS or Android app. It's very similar to React in terms of app structure and data flow. However, it uses native components instead of web components. Native components target native UI widgets instead of HTML. So instead of using something like a div that you would in HTML, you would use Vue, which gets rendered to a native UI view on iOS, or Android.view on Android. And just like in React, when your component's data changes, it will trigger a re-render. I'll also show you a side-by-side comparison of a React component and a React Native component shortly. But first, let's discuss pros and cons. So prior to React Native, native developers used an iOS software development kit or Android Studio, for which they needed to know Swift, Objective-C, or Java, depending on what platform you're designing for. The main disadvantage of using native SDKs is having to develop apps separately for each platform you want to cover. However, with React Native, there's a lot more shared code between iOS and Android. And on top of that, you can code for both using only one language, JavaScript. The main difference will involve style, since different platforms have different style guides, but we'll discuss that shortly. Another pro is live updating. So Android doesn't have this issue, but when a native iOS app has an update, it usually has to wait for App Store approval. With React Native, you can bypass App Store approval and publish live updates to your app as long as your app is set up to check for new versions. This is going to ensure that your customers have the latest versions of your app as soon as possible. And there's also some tools for enhanced developer experience. So you have hot reloading, where you won't have to wait for your code to recompile and restart your app if you've made small edits. Hot reloading is just going to make changes to your running app without having to restart. And like React, you can also use Chrome DevTools to debug. Lastly, a really cool thing about React Native is that it allows you to build your own native module if it doesn't already exist. You will, however, need to know Objective-C or Java in order to do so. They probably built this feature because the native framework is fairly young, which leads to my only con. So React Native came out in 2015, and some native API isn't supported yet. But you can use native libraries or build your own native module. But once again, you're going to need to know native code like Objective-C or Java to do that. So here are some popular apps using React Native. Of course, Facebook is one because they created React Native. Something I found really interesting is that the features Instagram built with React Native share over 90% of code between iOS and Android. Airbnb launched their Trips platform last year, and 90% of their code is written in React Native. So I'm sure this is the question that's probably on everyone's mind. What's the difference between React and React Native? I figured the best way to answer this question in a room full of React developers is to show you a code comparison of a React component and that same exact component in React Native. Okay. So React Native doesn't use HTML, so HTML components would need to be replaced with native components. If you look here, we have an HTML component called a div, and then the React Native version of that would be view, and then for where we have P, we'll have text in React Native. I'd also like to discuss a couple differences you're not going to see on here. Class name doesn't exist in React Native because we don't use CSS classes, but instead assign style sheets to components. Style sheets will appear similar to CSS, but slightly different because CSS specifically styles HTML and can't be used on native components. Lastly, React Router does not work for React Native, but React Native has its own navigator component to switch between views. It's a bit more difficult to implement, though. So the last thing I'm going to discuss is designing for Android and iOS, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to design for both of them. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more shared code between iOS and Android when you use React Native. You'll end up having two app entry points, an index.android.js and an index.ios.js, which can both import the same code sharing component, probably from a file called index.js. You can now work in your code sharing component, and your work will appear in both platform entry points. You can use the platform module from React Native and a conditional if you want to render something platform specific. You most likely want to do this for interface styles, since both platforms have different style guides. And essentially, much of your logic will most likely be the same, but your styles will be different, so it's also good to look in and study those UI style guides. Or you could not do any of that, and you can skip using learning about conditionals and style guides and just use nativebase.io, which will style your components to be platform specific all on its own. If you plan on creating your first React Native app, I highly recommend using Create React Native, which is a command line interface, and nativebase.io. In conclusion, React Native is the best framework to use for native development right now. So here are some resources to help you get started. I also included some style guide information as well. Thank you.